Night settles gently over Chicago, not all at once, but in layers. First the sun slips away behind the brick outlines of factories and warehouses. Then the streets dim, one by one, as gas lamps flicker to life and cast long, wavering shadows across wet pavement. Jazz drifts softly through the air, seeping out of basement clubs and half-hidden doorways, mixing with the distant rumble of elevated trains. To most of the city, this is simply the hour of rest, the moment when families lock their doors and pull their curtains tight. But to a select few, the night is not an ending. It is a beginning. In this Chicago, during the 1920s, power does not always announce itself with uniforms or badges. Sometimes it moves quietly, wrapped in expensive coats and confident smiles. Sometimes it travels in unmarked cars, stopping briefly under streetlights before disappearing again into the darkness. And at the center of this nocturnal world, whether seen or unseen, stands a man whose name would become inseparable from the city itself. Alphonse Gabriel Capone. To some, he was a provider. To others, a ruthless tyrant. To the nation watching from afar, he became something almost unreal, a symbol of crime, excess, and fear woven together. Yet the true story of Al Capone does not begin with gunfire or headlines. It begins with atmosphere. With the feeling of a city holding its breath after sunset. With the unspoken understanding that while the law slept, another order ruled. Capone did not merely live in the night. He understood it. He shaped it. He used it as both shield and weapon, knowing that darkness could conceal actions, soften conscience, and make even the unthinkable seem distant by morning. Chicago at this time was a city of contradictions. By day, it presented itself as a place of industry and progress, its skyline rising confidently along Lake Michigan. Men hurried to offices and factories, newspapers celebrated innovation, and politicians promised order. But by night, another Chicago emerged. One where liquor flowed freely despite the law, where laughter echoed behind locked doors, and where money moved faster when questions were not asked. Prohibition, meant to cleanse society, had instead created a vast shadow economy. And in that shadow, men like Capone flourished. What made Al Capone different was not simply violence, though violence was never far from him. It was his understanding of human nature. He knew that people wanted escape. They wanted to drink, to dance, to forget the rigid rules imposed upon them. He knew that fear could close mouths, but generosity could open doors. In the neighborhoods where his influence spread, soup kitchens appeared alongside speakeasies. Cash filled empty pockets just as surely as it filled envelopes passed quietly to police officers and politicians. The night, under Capone's rule, was both dangerous and comforting, depending on where one stood. As listeners drift deeper into this story, it is important to let go of the exaggerated image so often repeated. The snarling gangster with a cigar clenched between his teeth is only part of the truth. The real Capone was more complex, more calculating, and at times, unsettlingly calm. He preferred tailored suits to blood-stained shirts, polite conversation to shouting. He smiled easily, laughed loudly, and shook hands firmly. And yet, beneath that surface, decisions were made that ended lives without hesitation. Orders were given softly, and consequences followed brutally. There is something almost hypnotic about the way Capone moved through the world. He seemed to understand that visibility could be as powerful as secrecy. He allowed himself to be seen just enough to build legend, but never enough to be fully understood. Newspapers wrote endlessly about him, speculating on his wealth, his habits, his crimes. Photographers captured him stepping out of cars, attending events, grinning as if amused by the attention. But what happened after midnight, behind closed doors, remained known only to those who survived it. The night belonged to him because he made it so. Speakeasies opened with confidence, knowing protection had been paid for. Truck routes were memorized, schedules synchronized, signals agreed upon. The city became a living machine, humming quietly after dark, each part moving in rhythm. And Capone, at the center, ensured that the machine kept running. Those who cooperated slept peacefully. Those who resisted often found sleep impossible, haunted by the knowledge that nightfall could bring a knock at the door. And yet, for all his control, there was always an undercurrent of tension. Power gained in darkness is never truly secure. The same shadows that protect can also conceal enemies. Rivals watched closely. Allies whispered. Lawmen, embarrassed by their own helplessness, began to look for different ways in. Capone may have ruled the night, but even he could not stop the slow approach of dawn forever. What draws people to his story, even now, is not simply the crimes. It is the contrast. The way laughter and gunshots existed side by side. The way charity and cruelty shared the same hands. Al Capone embodied the contradiction of an era when laws failed to reflect human desire, and enforcement bowed to money and fear. Listening to his story is like walking through a city at night, aware that behind every lit window is a different truth. As this journey unfolds, it will move slowly, deliberately, just as the night itself does. From quiet beginnings to thunderous heights, and finally to silence. There is no rush here. Only the steady rhythm of history breathing in and out. The goal is not to shock, but to understand. To let the listener drift through time, guided by the soft glow of streetlights and the low murmur of a city that never truly slept. Because long before Al Capone became a headline, before he became a myth, he was simply a presence felt in the dark. A man who learned how to rule when others rested. And as the city surrendered itself each evening to shadows and sound, his influence spread quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when the entire nation would finally realize who truly ruled the night. Long before Chicago ever whispered his name, before power and fear wrapped themselves around his identity, Alphonse Gabriel Capone was simply another child growing up among millions of others, in a crowded corner of New York City. Brooklyn in the early years of the 20th century was loud, restless, and alive with possibility, but it was also unforgiving. Streets were packed with immigrant families chasing stability, each carrying memories of distant homelands and hopes that America might offer something better. For young Al, this world became his first classroom, teaching lessons that no schoolbook could ever fully explain. He was born in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents who had crossed the Atlantic with little more than determination and tradition. His father, Gabriel Capone, worked as a barber, a respectable trade that required long hours and steady hands. His mother, Teresa, kept the household together, raising their children in tight living conditions where privacy was rare and patience was essential. The Capone home was not violent, nor was it criminal. It was ordinary, shaped by routine, discipline, and the constant pressure of making ends meet. But outside the apartment walls, Brooklyn offered a harsher education. The neighborhood streets were crowded with boys who learned early that strength mattered. Respect was not given freely, it had to be taken, defended, sometimes fought for. Languages blended together in the air, Italian, Irish, Yiddish, each group carving out its own territory, its own sense of belonging. For a young boy watching from the sidewalks, it became clear that survival depended on more than hard work. It depended on loyalty, toughness, and the ability to stand one's ground. School never truly captured Al Capone's interest. Classrooms felt restrictive compared to the raw energy of the streets. Teachers demanded obedience, but outside, leadership was earned differently. Reputation mattered more than grades. Capone was not unintelligent, by many accounts, he was sharp and observant. But patience for authority came hard to him. When he clashed with a teacher and ultimately left school in his early teens, it marked a quiet turning point. Education would continue, but not within walls designed for order. As adolescence crept in, the pull of the streets grew stronger. Small gangs formed naturally among neighborhood boys, less like organized crime at first and more like social circles bound by shared struggles. These groups offered something deeply attractive: protection, identity, and purpose. For a boy whose world felt crowded and competitive, belonging mattered. Capone gravitated toward these circles, learning how alliances worked, how loyalty could be tested, and how quickly it could break. Brooklyn at night revealed a different rhythm. Storefronts closed, but street corners remained alive. Men gathered to talk business, legal and otherwise. Older boys carried themselves with confidence that younger ones noticed. They had money in their pockets, nicer clothes, and stories that hinted at power. For Al, these figures became symbols of success that did not require patience or permission. They seemed to live by their own rules, answerable only to each other. It was during these formative years that Capone learned one of the most important lessons of his life: fear and respect were closely linked. He saw how certain individuals could walk unchallenged through areas where others hurried nervously. He noticed how disputes were settled not by argument alone, but by the unspoken understanding of consequences. These observations settled quietly into his mind, shaping the way he viewed authority. Law was something external. Power was something personal. Despite this pull, there were still traces of ordinary childhood. Capone enjoyed music, laughter, and camaraderie. He was known to be social, even charming, able to make friends easily. He was not yet the hardened figure history would remember. He was still learning, absorbing, testing limits. But the balance between innocence and exposure was fragile. Brooklyn did not allow prolonged naivety. Mistakes carried weight, and lessons were learned quickly. As Capone entered his teenage years, his involvement with street groups deepened. Petty crime became more common, small acts that felt thrilling rather than dangerous. These early offenses were less about money and more about proving oneself. Each success reinforced confidence. Each confrontation hardened resolve. It was during this time that he began working various small jobs, including at a bowling alley and later at a bar. These environments placed him directly in the path of older men already involved in organized crime, men who recognized potential when they saw it. One encounter in particular would leave a permanent mark, both physically and psychologically. While working as a bouncer at a bar, Capone made a crude remark toward a woman connected to a local gangster. The response was swift and brutal. A knife flashed, leaving deep scars across Capone's face. The injury earned him the nickname that would follow him for life, though he despised it. More than pain, the incident delivered humiliation. It was a lesson in boundaries, respect, and the cost of arrogance. Rather than deterring him, the scars became a reminder. They hardened him. Capone learned that reputation could protect, but only if it was backed by real power. He became more careful, more controlled. Anger, when displayed without calculation, was dangerous. The streets had corrected him, and he adapted accordingly. This adaptability would become one of his defining traits. Within the Capone household, expectations remained traditional. His parents valued respectability, church, and family honor. There was a growing divide between the life Al was drifting toward and the one his family hoped he would lead. Yet this tension was never dramatic. It existed quietly, like two paths slowly separating. Brooklyn offered few easy alternatives. For many young men, the line between survival and crime was thin, often invisible until it had already been crossed. As the years passed, Capone's reputation among his peers grew. He was dependable, assertive, and unafraid. He showed early signs of leadership, not through cruelty, but through presence. People listened when he spoke. They followed when he moved. These qualities did not go unnoticed by those higher up the criminal ladder. Opportunities began to appear, subtle at first, then more deliberate. Brooklyn had shaped him thoroughly by the time he reached adulthood. It taught him that the world was not fair, that power mattered more than intention, and that loyalty was both priceless and fragile. It also taught him that environments could limit ambition. New York was crowded with men like him, all climbing the same narrow ladders. For Capone, the future would require movement. A change of scenery. A city where opportunity stretched wider, and the night offered more room to grow. The boy who walked Brooklyn streets carried these lessons with him, whether he realized it or not. They would follow him across state lines, into new alliances and greater risks. Long before Chicago ever fell under his shadow, the foundation had already been laid in the noise, struggle, and quiet ambition of a Brooklyn childhood that refused to let him remain small. By the time Al Capone reached his late teenage years, the streets no longer felt like a place of observation. They had become a testing ground. Brooklyn had already taught him how to watch, how to listen, and how to survive, but now it demanded something more. Choices carried sharper consequences, and reputations, once formed, hardened quickly. For Capone, this period marked the slow but decisive shift from restless youth into something far more dangerous. Petty crimes, once thrilling and almost playful, began to feel routine. Small thefts, intimidation, running errands for older figures, these acts blended into daily life. There was a rhythm to it, a structure that felt strangely organized despite its illegality. Capone learned that crime, when done properly, was not chaos. It was coordination. Timing mattered. Silence mattered. Above all, trust mattered, and trust was rare. As he spent more time around older gang members, Capone absorbed their unspoken rules. He watched how they handled disputes, how they spoke differently depending on who was listening. Respect was not about volume, it was about certainty. A man who appeared calm while issuing a threat was far more frightening than one who shouted. These lessons settled deeply into Capone's behavior. He became more controlled, less impulsive, understanding that fear worked best when it was understated. It was during this time that Capone became loosely affiliated with the 5 Points Gang, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York. This was not yet the refined syndicate structure of later years, but it was organized enough to offer guidance, protection, and opportunity. Leaders like Johnny Torrio moved through these circles, men who preferred strategy to spectacle. Capone noticed them immediately. They carried themselves differently. Their authority was quiet but absolute. The 5 Points Gang exposed Capone to a broader vision of crime. This was not just about street corners or neighborhood disputes. It was about territory, supply chains, influence. It was about knowing which police officers could be trusted, which politicians could be bought, and which rivals needed to be eliminated before they became threats. Capone listened more than he spoke, storing information away, learning how systems were built and maintained. Around this same time, Capone found work as a bouncer at the Harvard Inn, a bar owned by a gangster named Frankie Yale. The job placed him directly at the intersection of nightlife, crime, and power. Bars were gathering points, where alcohol loosened tongues and tempers flared. Capone's role was to keep order, to ensure that disputes ended quickly and decisively. It was here that he learned how to manage chaos without drawing attention from authorities. One night, a moment of carelessness changed everything. Capone made a crude comment toward a young woman, unaware or dismissive of her connections. Her brother, a man with deep ties to local gangs, confronted him. The confrontation escalated swiftly. A knife appeared. In seconds, Capone's face was slashed deeply, leaving permanent scars that ran from ear to mouth. The pain was immediate, but the humiliation cut deeper. The scars became a mark he could never erase. Though the world would later use the nickname Scarface, Capone himself despised it. To him, the scars represented a moment of weakness, a failure to read the room, to understand the invisible boundaries that governed his world. But rather than breaking him, the incident reshaped him. It taught him restraint. It taught him that words could be as dangerous as weapons. Recovery was slow, both physically and emotionally. As the wounds healed, Capone became more introspective. He spoke less, observed more. The swagger of youth gave way to a colder confidence. He began to understand that true power did not announce itself. It waited. The scars served as a constant reminder of the cost of underestimating others, a lesson he would never forget. In the aftermath, Capone's reputation paradoxically grew. Surviving such an attack, continuing to work, refusing to retreat, all signaled resilience. Among criminals, resilience was respected. He proved that he could take punishment and adapt. That adaptability made him valuable. Older figures began to see him not just as muscle, but as potential leadership material. During this period, Capone also became more involved in organized operations. He ran errands, collected payments, and occasionally enforced rules when others stepped out of line. These tasks were not glamorous, but they were essential. Each assignment tested loyalty and competence. Capone passed these tests consistently. He was dependable, and in that world, dependability was currency. Violence, when it came, was no longer random. It was calculated. Capone learned when to escalate and when to step back. He understood that unnecessary bloodshed attracted attention, and attention was dangerous. This balance between force and discretion would later define his leadership style. He was not reckless. He was patient. At home, the divide between his street life and family life widened. His parents noticed changes: longer hours away, unexplained injuries, unfamiliar associates. But conversations remained limited. In immigrant households, survival often left little room for confrontation. There was an unspoken hope that this phase would pass, that Al would settle into something legitimate. But the streets had already claimed him. By his early 20s, Capone had outgrown Brooklyn's limitations. The city was crowded with ambition, with too many men competing for too little space. Opportunities existed, but advancement was slow and dangerous. Meanwhile, stories drifted in from the Midwest, from a city where Prohibition had created a booming underground economy. Chicago. A place where liquor flowed, where gangs needed capable men, and where the night offered wider horizons. Johnny Torrio, now established in Chicago, saw in Capone a familiar combination of intelligence, loyalty, and controlled aggression. An invitation was extended. It was not dramatic, not urgent. Simply an opportunity. For Capone, it felt like destiny. Brooklyn had shaped him, scarred him, educated him. But Chicago promised something more. It promised scale. As he prepared to leave New York, Capone carried more than a suitcase. He carried lessons written in blood and silence. He had learned how quickly mistakes could mark you forever, how respect could be lost in seconds and earned only through consistency. He had learned that power required both fear and favor, and that the night belonged to those who understood its rules. The boy who once watched street corners had become a man ready to claim them. The scars on his face told a story of recklessness corrected by experience. And as the train carried him westward, away from the crowded streets of Brooklyn, Alabama, Capone was no longer merely becoming a criminal. He was becoming something far more enduring, a figure shaped by violence, restraint, and ambition, ready to step into a city that would soon bend to his will. The decision to leave New York was not made in a moment of excitement or desperation. It came quietly, like so many turning points in Al Capone's life. Brooklyn had given him everything it could: hard lessons, permanent scars, and a clear understanding of how the underworld functioned. But it had also shown him its limits. Too many eyes, too many rival ambitions, too little room to rise without drawing dangerous attention. For a man learning the value of patience and scale, it was time to move. Chicago existed in Capone's mind long before he ever saw it. Stories traveled easily along criminal networks, carried by men who moved between cities in search of opportunity. Chicago was spoken of as a place where the night stretched wider, where Prohibition had created endless demand and weak enforcement. It was a city growing faster than it could control itself. Factories roared by day, and by night, thirst took over. For someone like Capone, the promise was obvious. The invitation came through Johnny Torrio, a man Capone respected deeply. Torrio was not flashy, not loud. He was thoughtful, strategic, and already well established in Chicago's criminal hierarchy. To Capone, Torrio represented what he himself aspired to become: powerful without chaos, feared without spectacle. When Torrio suggested that Capone come west, it was not framed as an escape, but as a progression. A step forward. Saying goodbye to Brooklyn did not involve dramatic farewells. Capone left behind family, familiar streets, and the neighborhoods that had shaped him. There was comfort there, even in hardship. But comfort had never been his goal. The streets of Brooklyn faded behind him as the train began its long journey west, carrying him away from the noise of the Atlantic coast and towards something unknown. The train ride itself was a liminal space, suspended between past and future. Hours passed in the steady rhythm of steel wheels on tracks. Outside the window, cities gave way to open land, a reminder that America was larger than the narrow streets he had always known. Capone sat with his thoughts, perhaps reflecting on the lessons learned, perhaps imagining what awaited him. He was not afraid. He was focused. Chicago greeted him with movement and tension. It was a city still finding its identity, balancing industry and lawlessness in equal measure. Smoke rose constantly from factories, and the streets buzzed with energy at all hours. Unlike New York, where power was fragmented and deeply entrenched, Chicago's underworld was still organizing itself. This made it dangerous, but also full of opportunity. Torrio wasted no time introducing Capone to his new environment. The operations were already in motion: brothels, gambling houses, and soon, liquor distribution networks poised to expand under Prohibition. Capone observed closely, resisting the urge to assert himself too quickly. He understood that in a new city, reputation had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Respect could not be assumed. It had to be earned again. What struck Capone most was the scale. Chicago's geography allowed for movement in ways Brooklyn never had. Trucks could travel longer routes with fewer interruptions. Warehouses sat on the outskirts, perfect for storage. Neighborhoods were more clearly defined, each with its own vulnerabilities. The city felt less crowded, less watched. It was a place where systems could be built rather than merely navigated. Capone's early tasks in Chicago mirrored those he had performed in New York, but with greater stakes. He collected payments, enforced rules, and ensured smooth operations. Torrio watched carefully, evaluating not just Capone's effectiveness, but his judgment. Capone proved reliable, handling conflicts with a measured approach that aligned with Torrio's philosophy. Violence was used sparingly, strategically. The goal was stability, not chaos. As Prohibition took hold, the city changed rapidly. Bars closed officially, but opened quietly under new names and new ownership. Demand for alcohol surged, and with it, profits. Capone recognized immediately that this was more than a criminal opportunity, it was an economic transformation. The law had created scarcity, and scarcity had created power for those willing to supply what was forbidden. Capone's role expanded as operations grew. He demonstrated an ability to manage people, to coordinate logistics, and to anticipate problems before they escalated. He understood that every successful operation relied on cooperation, from truck drivers to bartenders to corrupt officials. He treated these relationships like investments, maintaining loyalty through payment and protection. Chicago's nights soon began to resemble a carefully choreographed performance. Liquor shipments moved under cover of darkness. Speakeasies operated with confidence. Police patrols followed predictable patterns. Capone absorbed it all, refining his understanding of urban control. He saw how a city could be managed like a business, with supply lines, customer demand, and risk mitigation. Despite his growing influence, Capone remained largely in the background during these early years. Torrio was the face of the organization, and Capone was content to learn. He knew that patience now would pay dividends later. The scars on his face reminded him daily of the cost of impulsiveness. In Chicago, he chose calculation over bravado. Yet danger was never far away. Rival gangs watched Torrio's operations with envy. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, occasionally erupting into violence. Capone observed how Torrio responded, not with retaliation alone, but with negotiation, alliances, and strategic withdrawals when necessary. These responses reinforced Capone's belief that survival depended on adaptability. Chicago was shaping him in new ways. The city's openness allowed his ambition to stretch further than it ever had in Brooklyn. He began to imagine not just participating in operations, but controlling them. The idea did not surface as arrogance, but as inevitability. Torrio would not rule forever. And when the time came, someone would need to step forward. As Capone settled into his new life, the distance from Brooklyn grew not just in miles, but in identity. He was no longer simply a product of the streets he grew up on. He was becoming part of something larger, something structured and powerful. The move west had not been an escape. It had been an ascent. The train that brought him to Chicago had carried a man shaped by experience, restraint, and ambition. What it delivered was the beginning of transformation. In the quiet hours of the night, as the city hummed with illegal commerce and unspoken agreements, Al Capone found his footing. The stage was set. The city was ready. And the night, vast and full of promise, awaited its next ruler. In Chicago, Al Capone quickly learned that power did not always come from the man who spoke the loudest or carried the biggest gun. It often came from the one who understood when to act and when to wait. Johnny Torrio embodied this philosophy perfectly. Calm, deliberate, and almost scholarly in his approach to crime, Torrio ran his operations like a careful businessman rather than a street fighter. For Capone, working under Torrio felt less like serving a boss and more like attending a private education in how real power was built and maintained. Torrio believed that violence was a tool, not a lifestyle. Every action, especially every act of force, had to serve a purpose. Unnecessary bloodshed attracted attention, and attention invited collapse. Capone absorbed this lesson deeply. He watched how Torrio handled conflicts, often choosing negotiation or compromise over confrontation. When violence was unavoidable, it was swift and decisive, designed to end problems rather than escalate them. Their relationship was rooted in mutual respect. Torrio saw in Capone a rare combination of loyalty, intelligence, and controlled aggression. Capone, in turn, admired Torrio's ability to command loyalty without fear alone. Meetings were quiet affairs, filled with discussion rather than shouting. Plans were made carefully, considering long-term consequences. This environment sharpened Capone's instincts, pushing him beyond the impulsive habits of his youth. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone began to understand crime as an ecosystem. Every player, from the lowest runner to the highest official on the payroll, served a function. Disrupting one part of the system could ripple outward, causing unintended damage. Capone learned to think in terms of balance. Keeping operations profitable required not just intimidation, but stability. One of Torrio's greatest lessons involved relationships with legitimate society. Police officers, judges, and politicians were not enemies to be avoided, but obstacles to be managed. Torrio cultivated these relationships carefully, using bribes, favors, and mutual interests to ensure cooperation. Capone observed how envelopes changed hands quietly, how promises were honored, and how betrayal was punished discreetly. These interactions taught him that influence was often more effective than force. As Prohibition tightened its grip, Torrio expanded his operations strategically. Rather than flooding the city with liquor and inviting chaos, he built a controlled distribution network. Capone played a key role in enforcing this structure. He ensured that competitors understood boundaries and that internal discipline was maintained. His presence alone often resolved disputes, as his reputation for firmness spread. Capone's confidence grew, but it remained tempered by Torrio's oversight. When Capone pushed too aggressively, Torrio pulled him back. When Capone hesitated, Torrio encouraged calculated risk. This dynamic allowed Capone to refine his judgment. He learned that timing was everything. Acting too early could be as dangerous as acting too late. Torrio also emphasized the importance of image. Public perception mattered, even in the underworld. A leader who appeared reasonable and composed was less likely to provoke unified opposition. Capone took note, adjusting his demeanor accordingly. He dressed well, spoke politely, and avoided unnecessary displays of cruelty. Behind closed doors, however, discipline was strict. The contrast between public charm and private enforcement became a hallmark of Capone's later rule. One of the most significant lessons Torrio imparted was the value of delegation. No leader could manage every detail alone. Trusting capable subordinates was essential. Capone began identifying individuals who demonstrated loyalty and competence, placing them in positions of responsibility. This early experience in leadership prepared him for the larger organization he would one day command. The calm structure Torrio built did not go unnoticed by rivals. As profits grew, so did envy. Competing gangs tested boundaries, probing for weakness. Torrio responded with caution, preferring alliances where possible. Capone watched these maneuvers closely, learning how diplomacy could delay or even prevent violence. Yet he also recognized that not all conflicts could be resolved peacefully. The inevitable clash came when Torrio was targeted by rival forces seeking to disrupt his control. One evening, Torrio was ambushed and severely wounded. Though he survived, the attack shook him deeply. For Capone, it was a stark reminder of the fragility of power, even when exercised wisely. Torrio's recovery was slow, and during this time, Capone assumed greater responsibility, keeping operations running smoothly. This period tested Capone's abilities more than any previous assignment. He had to balance firmness with restraint, authority with humility. The organization could not appear vulnerable. Capone succeeded, maintaining stability while Torrio healed. His performance did not go unnoticed. Torrio began to see Capone not just as an apprentice, but as a successor. When Torrio eventually decided to step away from active leadership, it was not out of weakness, but wisdom. He understood that survival sometimes required retreat. The world they operated in was changing, becoming more dangerous as law enforcement adapted. Torrio chose life over legend. In doing so, he passed the torch. For Capone, this transition was profound. He had learned everything Torrio could teach him. Strategy, patience, restraint, and the art of quiet influence. The man who once relied on instinct now relied on planning. The student had become ready to lead. Chicago, under Torrio's guidance, had been a classroom. Capone emerged from it transformed. He understood that ruling the night required more than intimidation. It required systems, alliances, and a steady hand. As Torrio faded into the background, Capone stepped forward, carrying with him the lessons of his mentor. The night was no longer something he navigated. It was something he was prepared to command. When the Volstead Act came into force, it did not arrive with the drama many had expected. There were no sudden sea lights sweeping the streets, no universal surrender of glasses and bottles. Instead, prohibition settled over the country like a quiet fog, confusing, inconvenient, and widely ignored. In Chicago, the change was felt almost immediately, not as an absence, but as a transformation. The city did not stop drinking. It simply learned how to drink in the dark. For men like Al Capone, prohibition was not a moral debate. It was an economic reality. Demand had not disappeared, it had multiplied. The law had turned ordinary habits into criminal acts overnight, creating millions of potential customers. Capone understood this instinctively. Where the government saw restriction, he saw opportunity. Where others hesitated, unsure how to adapt, he began to think in terms of supply chains and distribution. Johnny Torrio had already laid the groundwork, but prohibition accelerated everything. Breweries shut their doors officially, only to reopen quietly under different arrangements. Liquor arrived through complex routes, some from Canada, others produced locally in hidden distilleries. Each bottle carried risk, but also profit. Capone watched as the underground economy expanded rapidly, spilling into every neighborhood, every social class. Speakeasies began to multiply. Behind barber shops, beneath restaurants, in basements and back rooms, doors opened to those who knew the right words. Jazz played softly as glasses clinked in defiance of the law. Capone understood that these places were more than drinking establishments. They were hubs of influence. Information passed easily where people felt relaxed. Alliances were formed over shared bottles. Enemies revealed themselves through careless conversation. Capone's role grew as the scale of operations expanded. He was no longer just enforcing rules, he was helping design them. He worked closely with Torrio to ensure consistency across territories. Prices were set deliberately to avoid unnecessary competition. Quality was controlled to maintain customer loyalty. This was not chaos. It was organization, and it required discipline. One of Capone's greatest strengths during this period was his understanding of people. He knew that fear alone would not sustain such a vast network. Bartenders, drivers, suppliers, and guards all needed incentive. Capone ensured they were paid well and protected. When police raids occurred, bail money appeared quickly. Families were taken care of. This loyalty reduced betrayal and stabilized operations. Prohibition also reshaped the relationship between criminals and law enforcement. Police departments were underfunded and overwhelmed. Some officers enforced the law earnestly, but many recognized the futility. Bribes became routine. Capone observed how money could bend the law, how a well-timed payment could turn a blind eye. This understanding reinforced his belief that influence was more effective than open defiance. As profits surged, so did attention. Newspapers began reporting on the explosion of illegal liquor. Public opinion was divided. Some viewed bootleggers as criminals undermining social order. Others saw them as providers of a service the public wanted. Capone paid close attention to this perception. He began cultivating an image that softened his role. Charity donations, public appearances, and friendly interviews painted him as a businessman rather than a brute. Behind the scenes, however, the risks were mounting. Rival gangs sought to claim their share of the market. Disputes over territory became more frequent. Capone and Torrio responded with calculated force. Violence was not eliminated, but it was managed. Strategic strikes sent messages without escalating into full-scale war. Each confrontation reinforced Capone's understanding of power dynamics. Prohibition also introduced complexity. The supply of alcohol had to be constant. Any disruption could cost thousands in lost revenue and damage reputation. Capone oversaw logistics carefully, ensuring redundancy in routes and suppliers. If one operation was compromised, another could compensate. This adaptability kept the organization resilient. As the years passed, Prohibition normalized crime in a way previously unimaginable. Ordinary citizens became customers. Business owners became accomplices. The line between legality and illegality blurred. Capone recognized that this widespread participation created protection. When half the city depended on illegal liquor, enforcement became politically dangerous. Torrio's influence remained steady, but Capone increasingly became the face of operations. His charisma and confidence resonated with both allies and the public. He navigated the night with ease, moving between speakeasies and meetings, always composed. He rarely drank heavily himself, preferring to observe rather than indulge. Control, he believed, required clarity. Prohibition had turned Chicago into a marketplace of shadows, and Capone thrived within it. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. He understood that the law had unintentionally centralized power in the hands of those willing to organize. This realization shaped his ambitions. He no longer thought in terms of survival or advancement alone. He thought in terms of dominance. Yet beneath the success lay fragility. Every bottle sold carried legal risk. Every bribe created dependency. Every rival eliminated invited retaliation. Capone understood these dangers, but he accepted them as the price of power. The night offered opportunity, but it demanded constant vigilance. As Prohibition tightened its grip nationwide, Chicago became a symbol of defiance and excess. And at the heart of it all, quietly directing the flow of liquor and influence, was Al Capone. The law had changed the rules of society, but Capone had learned how to play the new game better than anyone else. The night was no longer just a cover. It was a marketplace, a network, a living system. And Capone had positioned himself perfectly within it, ready for the next stage of his ascent. By the mid-1920s, Chicago's nights no longer moved without resistance. The city pulsed with money, liquor, and quiet fear, and at the center of that pulse, Al Capone's influence was becoming impossible to ignore. Johnny Torrio was still present, still respected, but his shadow was lengthening, stretching toward retirement. Capone felt the shift before it was ever spoken aloud. Responsibility was settling onto his shoulders, not suddenly, but steadily, like the slow accumulation of weight that only reveals itself when one finally stands upright. The attempted assassination of Torrio marked a turning point. Though he survived, the attack shook him deeply. For a man who had built his power on calculation and restraint, the randomness of violence had become intolerable. He had won, and yet he had nearly lost everything. During Torrio's recovery, Capone stepped fully into operational control. The transition was quiet, almost seamless. Orders continued to be followed. Payments continued to flow. The machine did not stall. Capone's leadership style began to take shape during this period. He did not seek chaos or bloodshed for its own sake. Instead, he emphasized consistency. Territories were clearly defined. Expectations were communicated plainly. Disobedience was punished, but not publicly unless necessary. This created an atmosphere of predictability, which, in the criminal world, was a rare form of security. What set Capone apart was his ability to balance approachability with authority. He could sit at a table, laugh easily, tell stories, and make people feel valued. At the same time, no one doubted his capacity for violence if crossed. This duality made him effective. People wanted his approval and feared his disapproval in equal measure. As Torrio formally stepped away, Capone became the undisputed leader of the Chicago outfit. The rise was not marked by a single event, but by a series of confirmations. Rivals acknowledged his authority, either through agreement or silence. Law enforcement, increasingly frustrated, began to focus their attention on him specifically. Newspapers started using his name more frequently, often with a mix of fascination and alarm. Capone understood the power of image. He dressed impeccably, favoring tailored suits and polished shoes. He was often seen at sporting events, social gatherings, and charity functions. These appearances were deliberate. They presented him as a successful businessman rather than a criminal. To many in the public, he appeared almost respectable, a man who had found a way to thrive during uncertain times. Behind this image, the organization expanded rapidly. Bootlegging operations grew in scale, with increased production and wider distribution. Capone invested in breweries, transportation, and storage facilities, creating a vertically integrated system. This efficiency reduced reliance on outsiders and increased profit margins. It also tightened his control over the market. Rival gangs, particularly those led by George "Bugs" Moran, watched this expansion with growing hostility. Territories overlapped. Agreements were tested. Minor disputes threatened to escalate. Capone responded with a mix of negotiation and intimidation. He preferred to absorb rivals through alliances when possible, but he was not afraid to eliminate threats when necessary. Violence during this period was strategic. It was used to send messages, to enforce boundaries, to deter challenges. Capone understood that excessive brutality could unite enemies against him. He sought dominance, not destruction. This approach allowed him to consolidate power while avoiding full-scale war, at least temporarily. Internally, Capone demanded loyalty and competence. He rewarded those who performed well and removed those who did not. His inner circle was kept small, composed of individuals he trusted implicitly. Information was compartmentalized. No one knew more than they needed to. This structure minimized risk and reinforced his authority. As his power grew, so did his awareness of vulnerability. Capone invested heavily in protection. He traveled with bodyguards, varied his routines, and maintained multiple safe houses. Despite his public confidence, he understood the precariousness of his position. The same night that concealed his operations also concealed potential threats. The press played a crucial role in shaping Capone's legend. Journalists wrote about him as if he were a character in a novel, larger than life, embodying the excesses of the era. Capone did little to discourage this portrayal. Fame, he realized, could be a form of protection. A well-known figure was harder to eliminate quietly. Visibility created a shield of attention. Yet fame also attracted scrutiny. Federal authorities began to take a closer look. Traditional law enforcement methods had failed to contain him. Arrests came and went, rarely sticking. Capone paid fines, posted bail, and returned to business. Each failed attempt reinforced his sense of invincibility, but it also fueled the government's determination. Within the organization, Capone emphasized unity. He understood that internal conflict could be more dangerous than external threats. Disputes were settled quickly. Loyalty was reinforced through shared profits and mutual dependence. The outfit became not just a criminal enterprise, but a community bound by necessity and fear. As Capone settled fully into his role, Chicago's nights reflected his influence. Speakeasies operated openly, protected by his reach. Truck routes ran smoothly. Rivals hesitated before making moves. The city had not surrendered to him officially, but it had adapted around his presence. Capone did not see himself as a villain. In his own mind, he was providing what people wanted, creating jobs, and maintaining order in a chaotic environment. This self-perception allowed him to operate without guilt. He believed that the law, not his actions, was the true problem. By the end of this phase, Al Capone was no longer simply a powerful gangster. He was the defining figure of Chicago's underworld. His rise had been methodical, shaped by mentorship, opportunity, and restraint. The night, once a cover, had become his domain. And as his influence reached its peak, the forces gathering against him grew quietly stronger, waiting for the moment when dominance would give way to downfall. Power in Chicago during the 1920s did not rest solely in City Hall or police headquarters. It moved through quieter channels, slipping between offices, patrol cars, and courtrooms, carried in envelopes and unspoken agreements. Al Capone understood this reality better than most. He knew that to truly control the night, one had to shape the day as well. Guns could seize territory, but corruption could secure it. The city's rapid growth had outpaced its ability to govern itself. Political machines dominated local elections, built on favors, loyalty, and patronage. Capone recognized that this environment was not hostile to organized crime, it was fertile ground for it. Many officials were underpaid, overworked, and keenly aware of how dangerous enforcement could be. Capone did not need to threaten them. He simply needed to offer alternatives. Bribes became routine, structured rather than spontaneous. Police officers received regular payments to ignore certain establishments or tip off raids in advance. Detectives were encouraged to lose evidence or misfile reports. Judges, when necessary, were reminded of mutual interests. These relationships were not chaotic. They were managed carefully, with records kept, expectations clarified, and consequences understood. Capone treated corruption like an investment portfolio. He diversified. No single official was relied upon exclusively. This ensured that if one channel failed, others remained open. It also prevented any single individual from gaining leverage over him. Dependence flowed one way. Those who accepted his money became complicit, and therefore vulnerable. Political influence extended beyond law enforcement. Local politicians benefited from Capone's support during elections, receiving funding and, in some cases, subtle assistance in voter turnout. In return, they shaped policies, appointments, and budgets in ways that favored his operations. Enforcement resources were redirected. Investigations stalled. Prohibition enforcement units found themselves understaffed and ineffective. Capone understood the importance of maintaining plausible deniability. He rarely handled bribes personally. Intermediaries ensured distance between him and direct transactions. This insulation protected him legally and psychologically. He could maintain his public image while others handled the unsavory details. Chicago's neighborhoods felt the effects of this system. Speakeasies operated with confidence, knowing that raids were unlikely or announced in advance. Gambling houses ran openly. Residents learned which establishments were safe and which were not. The city adapted to this parallel order, often finding it more predictable than official law enforcement. Capone's relationship with the police was particularly complex. He viewed them not as enemies, but as participants in the same ecosystem. Many officers accepted payments reluctantly at first, then gratefully. The money supplemented low wages and compensated for risk. Over time, lines blurred. Loyalty shifted. The badge became less a symbol of authority and more a tool of negotiation. Yet corruption carried inherent risk. Officials could change sides. Political winds could shift. Capone was aware of this fragility. He maintained detailed knowledge of who owed him favors and who might become liabilities. Those who proved unreliable were cut off or quietly removed from influence. Public perception played a critical role in sustaining this system. Many citizens viewed Capone's corruption as a symptom rather than a cause of societal failure. Prohibition was deeply unpopular. When enforcement faltered, blame often fell on lawmakers rather than criminals. Capone capitalized on this sentiment, positioning himself as a pragmatic solution to an impractical law. He reinforced this image through selective generosity. Donations to charities, support for community events, and assistance during economic hardship created goodwill. During times of crisis, such as food shortages, Capone funded soup kitchens served thousands. These gestures were calculated, but effective. They complicated the narrative, making it harder to paint him as a simple villain. Behind closed doors, however, discipline was strict. Corruption was tolerated only when it served the organization. Officials who demanded excessive payments or threatened exposure were dealt with decisively. Capone understood that fear still had a role to play, but it was best used sparingly. As his network expanded, Capone became increasingly confident in his ability to shape outcomes. Court cases dissolved. Arrests led nowhere. He paid fines when necessary, treating them as operating costs. Each successful evasion reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. This sense of invincibility seeped into the organization. Associates grew bolder. Speakeasies operated more openly. The line between secrecy and spectacle blurred. Capone enjoyed the attention, believing that visibility provided protection. A public figure was harder to eliminate quietly. But this openness also attracted scrutiny. Reformers, journalists, and federal authorities began to take notice. They saw Chicago not just as a lawless city, but as a symbol of systemic failure. Capone became the embodiment of that failure, a convenient focal point for public outrage. Within political circles, pressure mounted. Honest officials found themselves marginalized or threatened. The system Capone had built was effective, but it was also brittle. It relied on widespread complicity, which could unravel if exposed. Capone sensed the shift but did not retreat. He believed that his influence ran too deep to be uprooted easily. He trusted in the relationships he had cultivated, the money he had distributed, and the fear he had inspired. For years, these factors had protected him. Chicago continued to function under this shadow governance. By day, officials spoke of law and order. By night, Capone's system ensured stability of a different kind. The city lived with this contradiction, accepting it as the cost of normalcy. Yet beneath the calm surface, currents were changing. Federal agencies, less susceptible to local corruption, began to coordinate. New strategies were discussed quietly. The same systems that had enabled Capone's rise were becoming targets for dismantling. For now, though, Al Capone stood at the height of his influence. He had bought time, loyalty, and silence. He had woven corruption into the fabric of the city so thoroughly that it seemed permanent. Chicago belonged to him not because he ruled openly, but because he had learned how to rule invisibly. The night was secure. The day, for the moment, was compliant. And Capone, confident and composed, continued to walk between both worlds, unaware of how close the balance was to breaking. Even as Al Capone's influence spread across Chicago, the night was never truly quiet. Power, once established, invites challenge. Beneath the smooth operation of speakeasies and the steady flow of money, tension simmered. Other men watched carefully, measuring Capone's reach, waiting for signs of weakness. In the criminal world, dominance is rarely accepted without resistance, and Chicago was no exception. The most persistent threat came from the North Side, where rival gangs controlled their own networks of liquor and gambling. At the center of this opposition stood George "Bugs" Moran, a man whose methods and temperament differed sharply from Capone's. Where Capone favored organization and diplomacy, Moran relied more heavily on brute force and territorial aggression. Their rivalry was not born overnight. It grew gradually, fueled by overlapping interests and mutual distrust. Early encounters were subtle. Trucks went missing. Deliveries were intercepted. Speakeasies loyal to one side were pressured by the other. Each incident tested boundaries, probing for reactions. Capone responded cautiously, avoiding immediate escalation. He understood that open war would attract attention from law enforcement and disrupt profits. Instead, he relied on intimidation and negotiation, sending clear messages without drawing headlines. Moran, however, interpreted restraint as weakness. His men continued to encroach, challenging Capone's control over key routes and neighborhoods. The North Side gang saw Capone as an outsider, a New Yorker who had risen too quickly. Resentment mixed with ambition. The city, divided by river and loyalties, became a chessboard where each move carried consequences. Violence began to punctuate the quiet nights. Isolated shootings, disappearances, and arson attacks unsettled the underworld. Capone monitored these developments closely. He adjusted security, reinforced alliances, and increased surveillance of rival movements. Information became invaluable. Knowing where Moran's men gathered, who they trusted, and when they moved allowed Capone to anticipate threats. Within Capone's organization, tension was managed carefully. He understood that fear of rivals could spread internally, undermining confidence. Meetings emphasized unity and resolve. Capone reassured his men that control remained firm. His calm demeanor during these moments reinforced loyalty. He did not panic, and therefore, neither did they. Attempts at negotiation were made, often through intermediaries. Agreements were proposed, territories discussed. But trust was thin. Each side suspected the other of deception. Temporary truces formed and dissolved, leaving behind deeper resentment. The rivalry became personal, each insult remembered, each loss avenged. As conflict intensified, the stakes rose. Innocent bystanders were occasionally caught in the crossfire, increasing public anxiety. Newspapers reported on gang violence with growing alarm. Capone disliked this attention. He preferred to operate unseen. Yet he recognized that retreat would embolden his enemies. Balance had to be maintained. Capone's strategy evolved. He authorized targeted actions designed to weaken Moran's operations without provoking full-scale war. Supply lines were disrupted. Key lieutenants were pressured or eliminated. These moves were calculated to create instability within the North Side gang, forcing Moran to react defensively. Moran, in turn, escalated. He sought alliances with other rivals, attempting to isolate Capone. The city's underworld fragmented further, loyalties shifting in response to fear and opportunity. Each faction watched the others, waiting for missteps. The psychological toll of this rivalry was significant. Capone became more vigilant, less predictable in his routines. He increased security and limited public appearances. Sleep came less easily. Power required constant maintenance, and the threat of betrayal was ever present. Despite the tension, Capone maintained a public facade of confidence. He continued to attend social events and speak with reporters. This duality, public ease and private vigilance, defined his leadership during this period. He refused to appear rattled, believing that perception shaped reality. The rivalry with Moran was not merely a clash of personalities. It represented competing visions of control. Capone's structured, business-oriented approach conflicted with Moran's more traditional, territorial mindset. The city could not sustain both indefinitely. Something had to give. As months passed, incidents accumulated. Each act of violence added weight to the scales, pushing both sides closer to an irreversible moment. Allies urged caution. Others urged decisive action. Capone listened, weighing options. He understood that hesitation could be fatal, but so could rashness. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the city rested uneasily, Capone contemplated the future. The night had once felt like an ally, a place of opportunity and control. Now it felt crowded with unseen enemies. He knew that to secure his position, he would need to make a statement so clear that it could not be ignored. What form that statement would take remained unspoken, even among his closest associates. Plans formed slowly, deliberately. The goal was not revenge alone, but finality. To end the rivalry in a way that reshaped the balance of power permanently. Chicago stood on the edge of a moment that would define its criminal history. The tension between Capone and Moran had stretched as far as it could without breaking. The night held its breath. And in that breath, decisions were made that would soon echo far beyond the city, altering not only the course of Capone's life, but the nation's understanding of organized crime itself. The morning of February 14, 1929, arrived quietly in Chicago. Winter held the city in a pale grip, the air sharp and still, the streets dusted with old snow darkened by soot. It was the kind of morning that discouraged lingering outside, encouraging people to move quickly, collars turned up, hands buried deep in pockets. Nothing about it suggested that it would become one of the most infamous days in American criminal history. In a modest brick garage on North Clark Street, 7 men gathered under the assumption that business was about to proceed as usual. They believed they were there for a routine transaction, a delivery of hijacked liquor arranged through familiar channels. These men were associates of George "Bugs" Moran's North Side gang, veterans of the long, bitter rivalry that had divided Chicago's underworld. They waited patiently, unaware that the careful choreography of the city's criminal night had reached a breaking point. What happened next unfolded in minutes, but its consequences would echo for decades. Shortly before 10:30 in the morning, a vehicle pulled up outside the garage. Men stepped out, 2 of them dressed as police officers. To those inside, this was not immediately alarming. Raids were common, and cooperation was often the safest response. The men inside lined up against the wall, facing bricks stained by years of oil and grime. There was no panic. No resistance. Only compliance. Then the sound shattered the illusion of routine. Shotgun blasts echoed through the enclosed space, followed by the sharp crack of handgun fire. The noise was overwhelming, violent, final. In a matter of moments, 7 men lay dead or dying, the cold concrete beneath them stained dark. The attackers left swiftly, maintaining the appearance of law enforcement as they exited, disappearing into the city before anyone could react. Bugs Moran himself was not among the dead. Delayed by chance, he had arrived late and, seeing what he believed to be police outside, turned away. That single twist of timing would haunt the story forever. The city awoke to the news in disbelief. Newspapers ran photographs that shocked the nation. The brutality, the precision, the audacity of the act stunned even those accustomed to gang violence. This was not a street shooting or a barroom dispute. It was an execution, carried out in daylight, disguised as law enforcement. The message was unmistakable. Though no one was ever convicted, the public narrative formed quickly. Al Capone's name dominated headlines. He was in Florida at the time, a detail that likely spared him immediate arrest, but few doubted where the order had originated. The massacre bore the marks of calculated strategy rather than impulsive rage. It was designed not just to kill, but to end a rivalry decisively. For Capone, the massacre represented a turning point, though not in the way he may have intended. From a criminal standpoint, the North Side gang was severely weakened. Leadership was decimated. Territory fell into chaos. Capone's dominance over Chicago's underworld became undeniable. Rivals hesitated. Allies grew more cautious. The balance of power shifted heavily in his favor. But power gained so dramatically comes at a cost. Public opinion hardened almost overnight. The romanticized image of the gangster as a charming rogue began to fracture. The sight of unarmed men executed against a wall forced Americans to confront the reality of organized crime. Editorials called for action. Politicians, long content to look away, found themselves under pressure to respond. Capone sensed the shift. Though he maintained his public composure, giving interviews and denying involvement, the atmosphere had changed. The attention he once welcomed now felt heavier, more dangerous. The massacre had stripped away plausible deniability. Even without evidence, the scale of the violence made neutrality impossible. Law enforcement agencies, previously fragmented and compromised, began to coordinate more seriously. Federal authorities, less entangled in local corruption, took a renewed interest. The massacre provided something invaluable: public support. What had once been seen as an internal criminal matter was now viewed as a national problem. Within Capone's organization, reactions were mixed. Some viewed the event as a necessary, even brilliant, stroke, swift and decisive. Others recognized the danger it had invited. Fear replaced confidence. Meetings grew quieter. Decisions were weighed more carefully. Capone himself became more guarded, increasing security and limiting exposure. The night, which had once felt like a domain of control, now seemed crowded with consequences. Capone continued to deny involvement, repeating that he was far from Chicago when the killings occurred. Technically, this was true. Strategically, it was insufficient. The massacre had crossed an invisible line. Violence had become spectacle, and spectacle demanded response. Journalists followed Capone obsessively. Every appearance, every statement was scrutinized. Reformers pointed to him as the embodiment of everything wrong with Prohibition. The government needed a symbol, and Capone had become it. Ironically, the massacre also exposed the limits of brute force. While it removed immediate rivals, it unified opposition. It energized investigators who had previously lacked resources or motivation. The federal government began exploring alternative methods to dismantle Capone's empire, methods that did not rely on eyewitnesses or confessions. Capone, for all his intelligence, underestimated this shift. He believed that fear and influence would continue to protect him. He had survived scandals before. He had outlasted rivals and evaded charges. To him, the massacre was a conclusion, not a beginning. But history would see it differently. As months passed, the shadows deepened. Capone's health began to suffer. Stress, constant vigilance, and the weight of leadership took their toll. Sleep became restless. The calm confidence that once defined him now required effort to maintain. Chicago, too, changed. The city no longer whispered about gang violence. It spoke loudly, angrily. Civic leaders demanded reform. Federal agents arrived with new authority. The gears of justice, slow but relentless, began to turn. The Valentine's Day Massacre, as it came to be known, froze a moment in time. It crystallized the era's contradictions, lawlessness born from law, order enforced through chaos. It marked the peak of Capone's visible power and the beginning of his irreversible decline. In the quiet after the gunfire, as snow continued to fall and the city tried to resume its rhythm, something essential had shifted. The night no longer belonged to him in the same way. It had revealed too much. And though Capone would continue to walk freely for a time, smiling for cameras and conducting business as usual, the echo of that February morning followed him everywhere. The wall in that garage had absorbed more than bullets. It had absorbed the moment when myth became liability, and when the ruler of the night unknowingly invited the dawn. In the months that followed the Valentine's Day Massacre, Al Capone found himself living in a strange duality. His power within the underworld had never been greater, yet his visibility to the outside world had become unavoidable. He was no longer just a name whispered in alleyways or passed between bartenders. He was now a figure known across the country, discussed at breakfast tables, debated in newspapers, and dissected by politicians. Fame, once a useful shield, had begun to feel like a spotlight that never dimmed. Capone understood the importance of controlling the narrative. If the public was going to watch him, he intended to shape what they saw. He gave interviews freely, often appearing relaxed and charming, speaking in plain language that resonated with ordinary people. He framed himself as a businessman operating in a flawed system, a man providing a service the public clearly wanted. His tone was calm, almost reasonable, and for many listeners, disarmingly persuasive. Photographs from this period show him smiling, well-dressed, confident. He attended boxing matches, social events, and charity functions. He shook hands, laughed openly, and appeared entirely at ease. This was not an accident. Capone believed that visibility humanized him, that the more familiar he became, the harder it would be for the public to fully condemn him. He wanted to be seen not as a criminal mastermind, but as a product of his time. Part of this strategy involved selective generosity. Capone's charitable activities expanded noticeably. He funded soup kitchens during the early years of the Great Depression, feeding thousands of unemployed men. These acts were widely publicized, and Capone ensured that his name was associated with them. To many struggling Chicagoans, the man feeding them mattered more than the rumors of violence attached to his reputation. This cultivated image created confusion. How could the same man linked to brutal murders also provide relief to the poor? The contradiction softened public opinion, at least temporarily. Some saw him as a modern-day Robin Hood, defying unpopular laws and redistributing wealth. Others saw the charity as cynical, a thin veil over cruelty. Capone accepted both interpretations. Controversy kept him relevant. Behind this public performance, the pressure was mounting. Law enforcement scrutiny intensified. Federal agencies coordinated in ways they never had before. Reformers pushed for action, using Capone as a symbol of everything wrong with prohibition and urban corruption. The atmosphere around him grew heavier, less forgiving. Capone responded by doubling down on his persona. He leaned into the role of celebrity gangster, giving statements that blurred the line between humor and defiance. He spoke dismissively of reformers, questioned the morality of prohibition, and emphasized his distance from direct violence. He knew that without hard evidence, accusations remained just that, accusations. Yet the constant attention took a toll. Every movement was observed. Every associate was scrutinized. Capone became more guarded, limiting access to his inner circle. Security increased. Routines were altered. The carefree public image masked a private awareness that the margins were shrinking. The press, once content with colorful stories, began to dig deeper. Investigative journalists examined Capone's finances, his connections, his influence. Articles shifted from fascination to condemnation. The tone hardened. What had once been framed as colorful criminality was now portrayed as a threat to national stability. Capone noticed the change. He still smiled for cameras, but his trust eroded. He understood that public sentiment was fickle. Admiration could turn to outrage quickly. The same newspapers that praised his charisma could just as easily call for his imprisonment. Despite this, Capone refused to retreat from the public eye. He believed that disappearing would signal weakness. Presence, even under scrutiny, demonstrated confidence. He continued to present himself as untouchable, a man above the fray. This period also revealed Capone's deep belief in his own logic. He genuinely saw himself as operating rationally within an irrational system. Prohibition, in his view, was the true crime. He argued that if the law were repealed, men like him would have no reason to exist. This perspective allowed him to rationalize his actions and maintain psychological equilibrium. However, this belief blinded him to the changing nature of the threat. The government was no longer focused solely on violent crimes. They were beginning to look at financial records, tax filings, and income streams. Capone dismissed these concerns, confident that his money and influence could shield him as they always had. The public, meanwhile, remained divided. In neighborhoods where his charity was felt, Capone was defended. In others, fear and resentment dominated. The city existed in a state of moral ambiguity, unsure whether to condemn or tolerate its most infamous figure. Capone's health began to show subtle signs of strain. Long nights, constant stress, and untreated illness wore on him. Though he maintained appearances, those close to him noticed changes, irritability, fatigue, moments of distraction. The weight of fame was heavier than the weight of secrecy. As the decade drew toward its close, Capone stood at the height of his notoriety. He was powerful, wealthy, and famous beyond any gangster before him. Yet the very qualities that had elevated him now threatened to undo him. Visibility had turned from asset to liability. The night no longer provided the cover it once had. Lights followed him wherever he went, literal and metaphorical. The world was watching, waiting for a mistake, a crack, an opening. Capone continued to smile, to speak confidently, to project control. But beneath the polished exterior, the balance was shifting. The story of Al Capone was no longer just a gangster's tale. It had become a national drama, and the final acts were beginning to take shape, even if he could not yet see them. As the attention surrounding Al Capone intensified, something subtle but profound began to change within him. The confidence that had once come naturally now required effort. Power still surrounded him, money still flowed, and his name still carried weight, but the ease was gone. Success had brought with it an unseen cost, one that settled into his thoughts during quiet moments and followed him into restless sleep. Capone had always understood danger as something external: rivals, law enforcement, betrayal. These were threats he knew how to manage. What he was less prepared for was the slow erosion of trust. Paranoia crept in gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. He began to question conversations, replaying words long after meetings ended. A pause felt suspicious. A glance lingered too long. Loyalty, once assumed, now required constant reassurance. His inner circle grew smaller. Men who had served him faithfully for years found themselves pushed to the margins, not because they had failed, but because Capone no longer felt certain. Trust, he discovered, was far more fragile at the top. The higher he rose, the fewer people he could truly rely on. Isolation became an unintended consequence of dominance. Capone's routines changed. He traveled less predictably, altered schedules without warning, and rotated security constantly. He slept in different locations, rarely staying in one place for long. These precautions were practical, but they also fed his unease. The act of constant vigilance reinforced the belief that danger was everywhere. Within the organization, this shift was felt immediately. Associates noticed Capone's heightened suspicion. Conversations became more guarded. Decisions took longer. Where once Capone relied on instinct and confidence, he now demanded verification. This slowed operations, creating friction. Some interpreted caution as weakness. Others saw it as wisdom. Either way, the atmosphere had changed. Capone's health also began to deteriorate quietly. Years of hard living, stress, and untreated illness took their toll. He experienced headaches, fatigue, and moments of confusion that he dismissed or concealed. Admitting vulnerability was unthinkable. To do so would undermine the image he had so carefully constructed. The sense of being watched never left him. Journalists followed his movements. Federal agents gathered information. Even casual outings felt staged. Capone could no longer distinguish between genuine encounters and calculated ones. Every interaction carried potential risk. Despite this, he maintained his public persona. Smiles remained, interviews continued, and charity efforts persisted. But those closest to him noticed the strain beneath the surface. His temper shortened. Patience thinned. Decisions that once came easily now required deliberation. Paranoia extended beyond personal safety. Capone became increasingly concerned about internal betrayal. He worried about informants, about men pressured by law enforcement or tempted by rival offers. He instituted loyalty tests, subtle and overt, to gauge commitment. These measures reinforced control but also bred resentment. The irony was painful. The organization had never been stronger, yet Capone felt weaker. Power had amplified every risk. The more he had to lose, the more he feared loss. This fear manifested not as panic, but as constant tension, a low hum of anxiety that never faded. Capone began to reflect on his past choices, though not with regret, but with calculation. He wondered which moments had brought him here, which decisions had accelerated scrutiny. The Valentine's Day massacre returned often in his thoughts. He did not dwell on the violence itself, but on its consequences. It had solved one problem and created many others. Sleep offered little relief. Nights were interrupted by thoughts of raids, arrests, betrayal. The darkness that once felt like protection now felt crowded with unseen threats. The night still belonged to him in name, but it no longer offered comfort. Relationships outside the organization suffered as well. Capone withdrew from social engagements, attending fewer events. When he did appear, his presence felt more guarded, less relaxed. Friends sensed the distance but rarely questioned it. Everyone understood that proximity to Capone carried risk. Within his family, concern grew. They noticed changes in his behavior, his health, his mood. But conversations remained cautious. The life Capone led did not allow for open vulnerability, even among loved ones. Silence filled the gaps where reassurance might have been. As paranoia deepened, Capone's decision-making became more conservative. He avoided unnecessary risks, preferring to maintain existing operations rather than expand. This shift frustrated some associates who saw opportunity in growth. Tension simmered beneath the surface, testing loyalty. The external pressure continued to build. Federal agencies refined their approach, quietly gathering financial data and coordinating across jurisdictions. Capone remained focused on traditional threats, underestimating the significance of these efforts. His attention was divided, stretched thin by the need to manage both perception and security. The contrast between myth and reality grew sharper. To the public, Capone remained a powerful, confident figure. To himself, he was increasingly aware of the fragility beneath that image. The illusion of control required constant maintenance, and the effort was exhausting. This period marked the beginning of an inward collapse, one that would not be visible in headlines or photographs. It unfolded slowly, in thoughts left unspoken and fears carefully concealed. Capone had mastered the external world of power and influence, but the internal world proved far more difficult to command. The night, once his ally, now mirrored his own state, dark, uncertain, and filled with shadows that could not be bribed or intimidated. And as he moved through this phase of quiet unraveling, the forces aligned against him continued their work patiently, waiting for the moment when his internal strain would meet external pressure, and the balance he fought so hard to maintain would finally give way. While Al Capone wrestled with growing paranoia and internal strain, a different kind of pressure was forming beyond his sightline. It moved quietly, without gunfire or headlines, and for that reason, it was far more dangerous than any rival gang. The federal government, long embarrassed by its inability to contain Chicago's underworld, had begun to change its approach. Instead of chasing shadows in alleys, it started looking at ledgers, signatures, and numbers. A new enemy was emerging, one that did not fear Capone's reputation. For years, law enforcement in Chicago had been fragmented and compromised. Local police forces were weakened by corruption, political interference, and intimidation. Prohibition agents were underfunded and often outmatched. Arrests were made, charges filed, but cases collapsed with predictable regularity. Capone had learned to treat these encounters as minor inconveniences, easily managed through influence and money. Federal authorities, however, operated differently. They were not tied to Chicago's political machine, nor were they as susceptible to local pressures. As public outrage intensified after the Valentine's Day massacre, Washington could no longer afford inaction. Capone was no longer just a criminal problem. He had become a political liability. Committees were formed. Reports were drafted. Quiet meetings took place behind closed doors. The question was no longer whether Capone should be stopped, but how. Traditional methods had failed. Witnesses disappeared or recanted. Evidence went missing. Jurors were compromised. The government needed a strategy that bypassed fear and corruption entirely. That strategy emerged gradually, shaped by patience rather than force. Investigators began asking a simple question: how did Al Capone live so extravagantly without any visible source of legitimate income? He owned expensive suits, traveled frequently, entertained lavishly, and supported an entire organization. Yet on paper, he claimed to earn almost nothing. This discrepancy, long ignored, became the focal point. Capone dismissed such concerns casually. He believed money was his greatest protection. Bribes had shielded him from countless charges. Fines were paid without hesitation. Lawyers were always ready. The idea that accounting could bring him down felt almost absurd. Violence he understood. Betrayal he anticipated. Paperwork did not concern him. But federal investigators were relentless. They began gathering financial records quietly, reconstructing Capone's income through indirect means. Bank deposits, real estate transactions, gambling receipts, and witness statements were compiled meticulously. This was slow work, requiring patience and precision. There would be no dramatic raids, no immediate confrontations. Just accumulation. Among those involved were men who approached the task with almost academic focus. They were not interested in Capone's legend. They cared about numbers. Patterns. Consistency. Each small detail contributed to a larger picture. Every unexplained expense became a thread. Capone remained largely unaware of the scope of this effort. He continued to focus on managing his organization and maintaining public appearances. His attention was divided, stretched thin by paranoia and internal tension. He underestimated the threat because it did not announce itself. Occasionally, Capone would hear rumors of investigations, whispers of federal interest. He dismissed them. The government had tried before and failed. He believed that without witnesses willing to testify, they had nothing. He trusted in the silence fear had purchased. What he failed to recognize was that this new approach did not require testimony in the traditional sense. It relied on mathematics. On the simple principle that income must be explained. If it was not, it became evidence itself. As the investigation deepened, federal agents avoided direct confrontation. They did not raid Capone's headquarters or arrest his lieutenants unnecessarily. Instead, they observed. They waited. The goal was not to disrupt operations prematurely, but to build an airtight case. This patience frustrated some local officials who wanted immediate action. But federal investigators understood the stakes. A failed prosecution would only strengthen Capone's sense of invincibility. They needed certainty. Capone's lawyers remained confident. They had navigated countless legal challenges successfully. They believed that even if charges were brought, they could be managed. The legal system, after all, had always bent eventually. Yet the environment was changing. Public tolerance had eroded. Judges were under scrutiny. Jurors were selected more carefully. The corruption that once guaranteed favorable outcomes was no longer as reliable. Capone began to sense the shift, though he could not fully articulate it. There were fewer friendly warnings, fewer quiet tips about investigations. Some officials who once accepted his money became distant. Others avoided contact altogether. The network of influence he relied upon was thinning. Still, Capone remained outwardly defiant. He continued to deny wrongdoing, to criticize prohibition, to portray himself as a businessman unfairly targeted. His statements grew sharper, more defensive. Confidence edged toward irritation. Behind the scenes, federal agents closed in. They identified witnesses who could speak not to murders, but to financial arrangements. Accountants, bookkeepers, associates with less to lose. These individuals were not motivated by loyalty or fear, but by self-preservation. The investigation reached a point of inevitability. Enough evidence had been gathered to move forward. Charges could be filed that did not rely on violence or intimidation. The law, slow but methodical, was ready. Capone, meanwhile, remained focused on visible threats. Rival gangs had been neutralized. Internal discipline was enforced. Public image was managed. He believed he had survived the worst. He did not realize that the most dangerous phase had already begun. The irony was stark. The man who had built an empire on control and calculation was about to face a system that mirrored his own methods, patient, organized, and relentless. There would be no dramatic shootout, no grand confrontation in the streets. The battle ahead would be fought in offices and courtrooms, with documents and dates. As the federal government prepared to act, Capone stood unaware at the edge of a new chapter. The night still belonged to him, or so it seemed. But somewhere beyond the glow of speakeasies and the comfort of familiar shadows, the machinery of justice was turning quietly, steadily, indifferent to reputation or fear. And when it finally moved into the open, it would do so with a force Capone had never truly faced before, one that could not be bribed, intimidated, or silenced. The idea that Al Capone might be undone not by bullets or betrayal, but by numbers, would have seemed almost laughable to him in his years of ascendancy. For a man who had navigated violence, corruption, and public scrutiny with remarkable ease, the concept of falling to paperwork felt absurd. And yet, quietly and methodically, that is exactly how the government chose to pursue him. Tax law, long considered dull and technical, became the sharpest weapon available. The principle was simple: income, legal or illegal, was still subject to taxation. Failure to report it was a crime in itself. This approach required no eyewitnesses to murder, no informants willing to testify about violence. It required only proof that Capone had earned money and failed to account for it. Federal investigators, led by determined and patient minds, set about reconstructing Capone's finances. They did not rely on Capone's own records, which were sparse by design. Instead, they pieced together evidence from a wide array of sources. Bank deposits made by associates. Testimony from bookkeepers. Receipts from gambling operations. Even casual statements overheard in conversations were catalogued and cross-referenced. This process was slow and painstaking. Each piece of evidence had to stand on its own. Investigators understood that Capone's legal team would challenge everything. Precision mattered. Dates were verified. Numbers were checked repeatedly. No assumption was left untested. Capone remained publicly dismissive of these efforts. He continued to claim that he lived modestly, that his wealth was exaggerated by the press. When questioned about income, he offered vague explanations or none at all. He believed that without direct documentation linking him to specific profits, the government would fail as it always had. What Capone underestimated was the power of inference. The law did not require proof of exactly where each dollar came from, only that Capone had received it. Evidence of lavish spending, combined with witness testimony, was enough to establish income. And once income was established, the absence of tax filings became damning. The government's strategy also included psychological pressure. Capone's associates were approached individually. Some were offered leniency in exchange for cooperation. Others were confronted with evidence of their own financial irregularities. The message was clear: loyalty could be expensive. Slowly, cracks appeared. Not dramatic betrayals, but quiet compliance. Individuals who had once felt protected by Capone's power now faced their own legal jeopardy. Self-interest outweighed fear. Statements were given. Records were shared. Each cooperation strengthened the case. Capone's legal team grew increasingly concerned. They recognized the seriousness of the tax approach, even if Capone himself remained skeptical. Lawyers advised caution, suggesting settlements or negotiations. Capone resisted. Conceding anything felt like an admission of weakness. He believed that confidence was his strongest defense. As the case took shape, federal authorities prepared carefully. They understood that Capone's trial would be a spectacle. Security concerns were addressed. Jury selection processes were scrutinized to prevent intimidation or corruption. Judges were chosen with care. Every detail was considered. Capone sensed the tightening net but struggled to respond effectively. His usual tools, bribes, influence, intimidation, proved less effective against federal agents operating under public scrutiny. The networks that had once protected him offered limited assistance. The system he had exploited was no longer as pliable. When the indictment was finally issued, it felt almost anticlimactic. No dramatic arrest in the street. No violent confrontation. Just formal charges, presented in legal language, accusing Capone of willfully failing to pay taxes on substantial income over several years. The irony was striking. A man linked to countless acts of violence now faced prosecution for a crime many considered mundane. Yet this mundanity was precisely what made the case powerful. It stripped away the mythology and reduced Capone to a defendant bound by the same laws as everyone else. Public reaction was intense. Some applauded the government's ingenuity. Others questioned why it had taken so long. Capone's image as an untouchable figure began to erode. The idea that he could be held accountable, even in this indirect way, shifted public perception. Capone responded with bravado. He continued to speak confidently, dismissing the charges as harassment. He trusted his lawyers and believed that his past success in court would repeat itself. Privately, however, doubt crept in. The evidence was different this time. Harder to dismiss. As preparations for trial continued, Capone's health worsened. Stress compounded existing illness. His focus wavered. The careful control he had maintained over his empire slipped as attention shifted to his own defense. Associates sensed the change and adjusted accordingly. The tax evasion case represented more than a legal battle. It symbolized a shift in power. The government had learned how to fight organized crime without confronting it directly. It had found a way to bypass fear and corruption through methodical analysis. For Capone, this was unfamiliar territory. He had built his life on understanding human weakness, fear, greed, desire. Now he faced an opponent that relied on rules and patience rather than emotion. It was a confrontation he had not prepared for. As the trial date approached, the sense of inevitability grew. Capone remained outwardly defiant, but the confidence felt thinner. The night no longer offered protection. The shadows that once concealed his actions now seemed to close in around him. The stage was set for a different kind of reckoning. Not one of gunfire or gang wars, but of testimony, evidence, and judgment. The man who had ruled the night was about to face the full light of day, and this time, there would be no place left to hide. When the trial finally began, it did not feel like the dramatic climax many had imagined for a man of Al Capone's notoriety. There were no gunshots, no shouting crowds, no grand speeches delivered from courthouse steps. Instead, there was quiet tension, heavy and deliberate, settling into the courtroom like a thick fog. The battle for Capone's future would be fought not with force, but with patience, procedure, and words carefully chosen. Capone entered the courtroom dressed impeccably, as he always was. His suit was tailored, his posture confident, his expression calm. To the casual observer, he looked every bit the powerful man the newspapers had long described. He smiled occasionally, nodded politely, and appeared at ease. This composure was intentional. Capone believed that confidence itself could influence outcomes. If he appeared unshaken, perhaps the system would bend as it always had. But the atmosphere was different this time. Security was tighter. Faces in the courtroom were unfamiliar. The judge was known for independence, the kind that could not be easily swayed by reputation or pressure. Even the jury selection process had been handled with unusual care. At one point, in a move that startled Capone's defense team, the entire jury was replaced at the last minute to prevent corruption or intimidation. This single act sent a quiet message: the old rules no longer applied. Capone noticed the shift immediately. The casual smiles faded slightly. His lawyers, seasoned and confident men themselves, grew more serious. They understood the significance of what was happening. The protections Capone had relied on for years were being systematically removed. The prosecution began not with sensational accusations, but with numbers. Income. Expenditures. Years. Dates. It was methodical, almost dull in its presentation, and that was precisely its strength. The government did not need to prove Capone had ordered killings or controlled bootlegging operations. They only needed to show that he had earned large sums of money and failed to pay taxes on them. Witnesses took the stand one by one. Some were former associates, others clerks or bookkeepers. Their testimonies were not emotional. They spoke plainly, recounting payments made, money handled, instructions given. Each statement added another thread to the growing net around Capone. The defense attempted to undermine credibility, to suggest coercion or misunderstanding. They argued that witnesses were unreliable, motivated by self-interest. But the evidence did not rely on any single testimony. It was cumulative. Each piece reinforced the others, creating a picture that was increasingly difficult to dismiss. Capone watched intently, his expression carefully controlled. Occasionally, he leaned toward his lawyers, whispering comments or questions. He still believed that something would turn in his favor, that a technicality or clever argument would unravel the case. This belief had sustained him through countless legal challenges before. But as the days passed, the weight of the proceedings became undeniable. The jury listened attentively. The judge maintained strict order. Objections were ruled on swiftly, often against the defense. The rhythm of the trial favored the prosecution's careful pacing. Capone's confidence began to erode in subtle ways. His posture stiffened. His smiles became rarer. Fatigue showed in his eyes. The courtroom, once just another stage, now felt like a trap slowly closing. Outside, public interest was intense. Newspapers covered every development, analyzing testimony and speculating on outcomes. The nation watched, fascinated by the possibility that the most infamous gangster in America might finally be held accountable. For many, the trial represented more than Capone's fate. It symbolized whether the law could reclaim authority after years of humiliation. Inside the courtroom, the defense made its strongest case. They argued that Capone was a victim of circumstance, targeted unfairly because of his notoriety. They questioned the morality of prosecuting a man for taxes when more serious crimes went uncharged. But this argument, while emotionally appealing to some, failed to address the core issue. The law did not operate on sentiment. It operated on statute. Capone took the stand briefly, a risky move designed to humanize him. He spoke calmly, confidently, denying intentional wrongdoing. He framed himself as a man with little formal education, unfamiliar with the complexities of tax law. His demeanor was composed, almost charming. For a moment, it seemed possible that this performance might sway opinion. But under cross-examination, the cracks appeared. Questions about income, expenses, and lifestyle exposed inconsistencies. Capone struggled to explain how he afforded his way of life without significant earnings. The answers grew vague. The confidence faltered. As closing arguments approached, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Capone's fate now rested not on influence or fear, but on 12 ordinary citizens tasked with interpreting evidence. This loss of control was deeply unsettling for a man who had always shaped his environment. The jury deliberated longer than some expected, shorter than others feared. When they returned, the room fell silent. Capone stood, his face unreadable. The verdict was delivered clearly, without flourish. Guilty on multiple counts of tax evasion. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Capone's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. The myth of invincibility shattered quietly, without spectacle. Sentencing followed soon after. The judge spoke firmly, emphasizing the seriousness of the crimes and the need for accountability. Capone was sentenced to a lengthy prison term and substantial fines. It was a punishment designed not just to confine, but to make an example. As Capone was led away, the contrast was striking. This was the man who had once ruled Chicago's nights, who had bent institutions to his will. Now he walked under guard, subject to the very system he had long manipulated. Outside the courthouse, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated. Others felt a strange emptiness. The trial had ended not with a bang, but with a verdict read aloud in a quiet room. Yet its significance was profound. For Capone, the trial marked the end of an era. Not just his own, but the era of open defiance that had characterized Prohibition's early years. The law had adapted, learned, and finally struck back. As he was taken into custody, the cameras captured his face one last time. The confidence was gone. In its place was something quieter, heavier. The realization that for the first time in his life, he was no longer in control. The night that once belonged to him had slipped away, not through violence or betrayal, but through the steady, unforgiving light of judgment. The sentence carried a weight that no amount of money or influence could lift. When Al Capone was formally committed to prison, the transformation was immediate and absolute. The man who had once moved freely through cities, surrounded by protection and privilege, now passed through iron gates under guard, his name reduced to an entry in a ledger. The shift from ruler to prisoner was not dramatic in its execution, but it was devastating in its finality. Capone's first days in custody were marked by a disorienting stillness. Accustomed to constant motion, decisions, and negotiations, he now found himself bound by rigid schedules and unfamiliar rules. Every aspect of daily life was dictated by others: when to wake, when to eat, when to move. The loss of autonomy struck deeply. Power, he learned, was not merely the ability to command others, but the freedom to choose one's own actions. That freedom was gone. Initially, Capone was sent to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Compared to what awaited him later, Atlanta offered relative comfort. His notoriety followed him, and prison officials treated him cautiously, aware of his past influence. Other inmates recognized him immediately. Some regarded him with awe, others with resentment. Capone carried himself with the same composed confidence he had always displayed, believing that even here, reputation could offer protection. At first, it did. Capone managed to secure certain privileges through charm and lingering influence. He obtained better living conditions, access to visitors, and some measure of comfort. In a world stripped of status, these small advantages mattered. They allowed him to maintain the illusion that he remained in control, even within confinement. But this illusion did not last. Reports of Capone's continued influence within the prison reached federal authorities. They were determined to ensure that his sentence would be more than symbolic. Arrangements were made to transfer him to a facility designed specifically to isolate and neutralize men like him. When Capone was moved to Alcatraz, the change was stark. The island prison rose from the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, isolated by distance and treacherous currents. Escape was nearly impossible. Communication with the outside world was severely limited. This was not a place where influence could thrive. Upon arrival, Capone's reputation meant little. Guards treated him as they did everyone else. No favors. No exceptions. His cell was small, bare, and cold. The routines were strict and unyielding. For the first time in his adult life, Capone was forced to confront existence without privilege. The psychological impact was profound. Stripped of authority and surrounded by silence, Capone struggled to adapt. The night, once his domain, was now filled with the sounds of metal doors and distant waves. There were no meetings to attend, no decisions to make, no strategies to plan. Time stretched endlessly, measured only by meals and headcounts. Capone attempted to maintain dignity. He followed rules, avoided confrontation, and tried to blend into the regimented environment. But isolation gnawed at him. He was no longer feared or admired in the way he once had been. Among hardened criminals, his past offered no advantage. His health continued to decline. Years of untreated syphilis began to affect his nervous system more severely. Symptoms that had once been subtle became more pronounced. He experienced memory lapses, confusion, and difficulty concentrating. These changes were frightening, though he rarely acknowledged them openly. Medical care in prison was limited, and treatments of the time were ineffective. Capone's condition progressed steadily. He found it increasingly difficult to maintain the sharpness that had once defined him. Conversations became harder to follow. Tasks that required focus were exhausting. The man who had built an empire through calculation and control now struggled with simple routines. This loss of mental clarity was perhaps more devastating than imprisonment itself. It robbed him of the inner world he still possessed when external power was gone. Capone's interactions with other inmates were minimal. He kept to himself, aware that vulnerability could invite exploitation. His former charisma faded into quiet reserve. Guards noted his withdrawal, his declining condition, but their concern was limited by the institution's purpose. Alcatraz was not a place for rehabilitation. It was a place of containment. Letters from family provided some comfort, though they also reminded him of what he had lost. The outside world moved on without him. Prohibition eventually ended. New criminal figures rose and fell. The empire he once commanded dissolved or transformed under new leadership. Capone's name remained famous, but his influence was gone. As years passed, Capone became a shadow of the man he had been. The sharp suits, the confident stride, the commanding presence, all belonged to another life. In their place was a quiet prisoner, aging rapidly, his mind betraying him. The irony was inescapable. Capone had feared betrayal, violence, and arrest. He had prepared for external threats all his life. What he had not prepared for was the slow erosion from within. Prison did not break him through force. It broke him through monotony and isolation. When Capone was eventually released due to his declining health, he left Alcatraz not as a defeated king, but as a diminished man. The gates opened, but the freedom they offered was limited. The world he returned to was unfamiliar, indifferent. The sentence that had begun as a legal punishment had become something deeper. It had stripped Capone of illusion, influence, and identity. The man who once ruled the night now faced a future defined by fragility and fading memory. The descent from power to imprisonment was complete. There would be no return to dominance, no second ascent. Only the quiet aftermath of a life spent chasing control, ending in a place where control was impossible. And in that silence, the legend of Al Capone began its final transformation, from feared ruler to cautionary figure, shaped not by violence or rivalry, but by the unforgiving passage of time behind bars. Alcatraz was unlike any place Al Capone had ever known. The island rose from the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, jagged and imposing, surrounded by currents that could claim a man in moments. For someone accustomed to wielding power and commanding respect, the stark isolation was suffocating. There were no neighborhoods to charm, no officials to bribe, no allies whose loyalty could be assured through fear or generosity. The rules of the outside world did not apply here. Control had been stripped away, leaving only the prisoner and the unyielding structure around him. Capone arrived at Alcatraz in 1934, escorted by armed guards who treated him with the measured caution reserved for notorious criminals. For the first time in years, he was fully anonymous, a single figure among many men who had lived lives as dangerous and violent as his own. Yet anonymity did not come with comfort. The island's barracks were Spartan, each cell a small, cold space with barely enough room to move. A narrow cot, a sink, a toilet, and a small window were all that separated him from the endless expanse of concrete and steel that made up the prison complex. The adjustment was immediate. Capone, who had thrived in chaos by creating his own order, now faced a world dominated by schedules, rules, and routines imposed without negotiation. Lights flashed at fixed hours, meals arrived like clockwork, and movement was restricted to designated times. The freedom to act independently had vanished. Decisions that had once shaped the lives of thousands were now limited to choosing when to eat or when to sleep. Even in minor things, autonomy was denied. At first, Capone attempted to assert his presence in small ways. He interacted with other inmates, some of whom recognized him immediately. He spoke with authority, maintained a confident posture, and relied on the remnants of his reputation to secure small privileges. Guards, aware of his notoriety, treated him with caution, allowing him slightly more freedom than other prisoners, though nothing approached the influence he once wielded. But Alcatraz was designed to neutralize precisely this kind of personality. Authority outside the prison meant nothing here. Other inmates, equally dangerous in their own right, were not easily intimidated. Rivalries had to be managed through quiet observation rather than confrontation. Capone's usual strategies, fear, respect, alliances, were largely ineffective. He was, for the first time, forced to navigate an environment in which power was distributed differently and influence was limited. The psychological impact was profound. For a man whose identity had long been tied to control, being subject to the same routines as every other prisoner was humiliating. Sleep was restless, filled with the sounds of distant footsteps, clanging doors, and the low murmur of other inmates. The night, which had once been his domain, now felt oppressive. There was no sanctuary, no dark alley where he could command attention or shape events. Only confinement. Health became an increasing concern. Capone had long suffered from syphilis, a disease that gradually attacks the nervous system if left untreated. In Alcatraz, the progression accelerated. Memory lapses became more frequent. Confusion and disorientation crept into his daily life. Tasks that once seemed simple, following instructions, remembering routines, began to challenge him. He struggled with names, schedules, and basic comprehension. The physical isolation was compounded by mental decline, creating a double layer of vulnerability. Despite these challenges, Capone attempted to maintain dignity. He followed rules carefully, avoided direct conflict, and kept interactions with both inmates and guards minimal but deliberate. Every word and gesture was measured. Pride, deeply ingrained over decades of asserting dominance, prevented him from displaying weakness openly. Even as his body and mind betrayed him, he tried to project composure. Relationships on the island were tentative. Some inmates sought his company out of curiosity or respect, others viewed him with suspicion or envy. Capone learned to navigate these interactions carefully, recognizing that social missteps could escalate quickly in such a contained environment. He relied on observation and subtle influence rather than the overt control that had worked in Chicago. Daily life at Alcatraz was both regimented and monotonous. Exercise periods, meal times, work assignments, and headcounts structured every day. Reading and correspondence offered limited relief, but even these were tightly monitored. The island's isolation meant that news from the outside world was delayed, filtered, and incomplete. The events that once shaped Capone's empire, rivalries, operations, financial decisions, continued without him. He could only watch from a distance as his influence diminished. This removal from operational control had a profound effect on Capone's psyche. Decision-making, once instinctive, was replaced by enforced obedience. The strategies that had served him so well in Chicago were irrelevant here. He could no longer negotiate outcomes, manage loyalty, or manipulate circumstances. The only path forward was adaptation. Medical attention was limited. Although prison staff monitored him, treatments of the time were insufficient to halt the progression of his illness. His physical health declined alongside his cognitive abilities. Episodes of confusion increased, and he experienced weakness and fatigue more frequently. These changes were frustrating and frightening, though he rarely admitted them openly. Visitors offered intermittent comfort. Family letters reminded him of life outside, yet also underscored the distance he now faced. The empire he had built had survived in his absence, but he no longer had a hand in its management. Those who once answered to him now acted independently, a reminder that time and distance could erode even the most carefully constructed power structures. Isolation at Alcatraz was total in more than physical terms. Capone's sense of self, the identity forged through charisma, violence, and influence, was slowly stripped away. Years in confinement gradually wore away the man who had once commanded Chicago with effortless authority. Al Capone, stripped of freedom, influence, and the constant engagement that had defined his life, began to face a more insidious adversary than any rival or lawman, the slow, relentless deterioration of his own mind and body. The syphilis he had contracted decades earlier, left largely untreated, had progressed to a stage that would ravage his nervous system and slowly erode his cognitive functions. Each day brought subtle changes at first, moments of forgetfulness, small lapses in judgment, but over time these moments became more pronounced, impossible to ignore, and increasingly terrifying. The decline was gradual, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, yet relentless. Where once Capone had been sharp, calculating, and quick to read situations and people, he began to struggle with tasks that had once been second nature. Routine instructions from prison staff required repeated attention. Conversations, once a medium through which he commanded respect, became challenging. He would lose track of topics mid-sentence, forget names, or repeat questions he had asked only moments before. These cognitive slips were frustrating and humiliating, especially for a man whose identity had been built on control and competence. Physical decline accompanied mental deterioration. Syphilis, untreated and progressing, weakened his body, sapping energy and vitality. Fatigue became a constant companion. Strength and coordination, which had once allowed him to command fear and enforce authority, began to falter. Even the simplest movements, walking to a work assignment, handling personal items, or performing basic hygiene, required more effort and concentration. The world he had dominated, the streets, the operations, the nights filled with activity and influence, had been replaced by confinement, monotony, and physical limitation. Al Capone's sense of self, long intertwined with power and public perception, struggled under these conditions. He had built an identity around dominance, respect, and fear, and now these qualities could no longer define him. Authority within Alcatraz was absolute, but not his. Decisions that once carried weight and commanded obedience were now made by guards and rules, leaving Capone with little to direct, influence, or manipulate. This loss compounded the psychological strain, creating a pervasive sense of vulnerability he had never before experienced. Interactions with fellow inmates became increasingly difficult. While some still recognized his name and past influence, Capone's ability to assert authority had diminished. Other prisoners treated him with cautious respect, but the edge that fear and reputation had provided in the past no longer carried the same weight. Conversations often left him confused or anxious, and misunderstandings could arise from simple lapses in memory. He became more withdrawn, retreating into quiet observation rather than engagement, a stark contrast to the man who had once commanded attention effortlessly. Even correspondence with family and associates, one of the few remaining links to the world beyond the prison walls, became taxing. Letters required careful attention, memory, and thought to respond appropriately. Reading and writing were exercises in patience and focus, complicated by cognitive lapses that sometimes made simple tasks overwhelming. These small challenges, repeated daily, reinforced a growing awareness that his capabilities were slipping, that the skills which had allowed him to thrive outside were failing inside. Al Capone's pride, carefully cultivated over decades, made adaptation difficult. He was accustomed to respect earned through action, intimidation, and savvy, yet these tools no longer applied. Reliance on staff, assistance from guards, or support from fellow inmates was necessary, but admitting dependence challenged the self-image he had long maintained. Each concession to limitation was a quiet humiliation, each moment of forgetfulness a reminder that he could no longer be the man he once was. The passage of time intensified this reality. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months, and the isolation of Alcatraz magnified the sense of stagnation. Without meaningful challenges or opportunities to assert influence, Capone's mind became increasingly introspective, turning repeatedly on past choices, mistakes, and regrets. He had spent decades shaping the world around him, yet now he could only observe it passively, powerless to intervene. This contrast between former power and present impotence weighed heavily on him, amplifying feelings of frustration and despair. Al Capone's social interactions outside the immediate confines of prison became non-existent. Media attention continued to follow him to some degree, but filtered through the distance imposed by incarceration. Reports of his wealth, influence, and notoriety persisted, creating a distorted reflection of the man he now was, diminished, frail, and increasingly dependent. The public image of invincibility collided with the private reality of decline, a contradiction that could not be reconciled within himself. Health complications extended beyond cognitive decline. Capone experienced a range of symptoms associated with advanced syphilis, headaches, tremors, and occasional confusion, all compounded by the stress of confinement. Sleep became erratic, sometimes fitful, sometimes restless, further eroding physical and mental resilience. The body that had once carried him through countless nights of negotiation, violence, and exertion now struggled under the weight of illness and inactivity. In this environment, Capone's sense of time and memory became increasingly unreliable. The once precise man, who had tracked operations, finances, and personnel with meticulous care, now struggled to retain continuity in his own life. Events blurred together. Details faded. Conversations lost context. His mental map of the outside world, the networks, alliances, and rivalries that had defined his existence, became increasingly abstract, fragmented, and inaccessible. Even routine prison activities, designed for simplicity and repetition, highlighted his limitations. Work assignments required effort and focus that Capone's deteriorating cognition increasingly challenged. He relied on staff or other prisoners to guide him, creating a sense of dependency that was foreign and uncomfortable. Autonomy, the cornerstone of his identity, was slipping further out of reach. Psychological stress compounded physical decline. The awareness that his abilities were failing created anxiety, irritability, and moments of hopelessness. Capone, long accustomed to directing his environment, now confronted a situation in which he had no meaningful control. Each day underscored the fragility of human capability, even for a man whose life had been defined by dominance and ruthlessness. Capone's reflection extended beyond personal decline to the consequences of his past life. He observed, from the distance of prison, the empire he had built slowly being dismantled, transformed, or appropriated by others. When Al Capone finally emerged from the confines of prison, the world he returned to was both familiar and alien. Florida, with its warm sun, swaying palms, and humid air, seemed a far cry from the frozen streets of Chicago or the fog-choked corridors of Alcatraz. On the surface, it was a paradise. But for Capone, it was a place stripped of the power, influence, and control that had defined his adult life. The empire he had once commanded no longer needed him, and the nights that had once been his domain were distant, populated by memories rather than activity. Capone's arrival in Florida was quiet, measured. He lived in a modest home, removed from the public eye, avoiding the fanfare that had once followed him like a shadow. The city and its residents knew little of him now beyond the occasional headline recalling his notoriety. Gone were the reporters hovering outside hotels, the flashing cameras, and the crowds of admirers and fearful onlookers. This anonymity, while initially liberating, carried an undercurrent of melancholy. Capone had been accustomed to attention, he had thrived in it. Its absence left a vacuum that was difficult to fill. Health dominated Capone's daily life. Years of untreated syphilis and the cumulative effects of prison had left him physically weak and cognitively impaired. Memory lapses were frequent, and mental clarity, once his greatest asset, was inconsistent at best. Tasks that had once required minimal effort now demanded concentration. Reading, writing, even conversation could become exhausting. His body and mind reminded him daily of the consequences of a life spent in extremes, indulgence, stress, and relentless vigilance. The decline of his faculties created a paradoxical existence. On one hand, he was free from the immediate dangers that had governed his life, rival gangs, assassinations, federal pursuit. On the other, he was imprisoned by his own body and mind. The world continued without him, moving past the empire he had created. Chicago evolved, leadership passed to others, operations continued in new hands, indifferent to the man who had once commanded fear and respect. This realization, quiet but persistent, weighed heavily. Capone's days were structured minimally, yet even routine brought challenges. Simple decisions, when to eat, when to rest, when to engage with visitors, required energy and attention. His once formidable stamina, built through decades of late nights and constant negotiation, was diminished. Fatigue dominated, and tasks that had previously seemed trivial became significant efforts. Physical exercise was sporadic, and long walks were limited by weakness and discomfort. Social interactions were fraught with difficulty. Visitors were few, carefully chosen, and brief. Conversations often exposed the gaps in his memory or reasoning, underscoring the contrast between past command and present dependence. Even family members, who provided companionship and comfort, were confronted with his diminished capacity. These interactions, though filled with care, highlighted the distance between the man Capone had been and the man he now was. Despite these limitations, Capone maintained elements of routine and habit that provided structure. He rose at regular times, maintained personal hygiene as best as possible, and engaged with the world outside his home through newspapers and correspondence. These activities offered small measures of control, fleeting reminders of autonomy. Yet they were mere shadows of the complex orchestration of daily life he had once managed in Chicago. Capone's reflections during this period were profound. He had spent decades building power through calculated decisions, intimidation, alliances, and strategic generosity. Now, stripped of authority, he was forced to confront the impermanence of influence. The fear he once inspired, the respect he commanded, and the myth that had surrounded him were reduced to memories. He observed, without ability to intervene, as life continued around him. Public perception remained a distant concern. Newspapers occasionally revisited his name, recounting his exploits, speculating on his health, or reflecting on his criminal career. These reports offered little more than historical interest, a reminder that the legend of Al Capone had outlasted his active control. The world was fascinated by the myth, yet indifferent to the man's current reality. Mental decline continued to impose limitations on Capone's activities. Cognitive lapses affected not only memory but judgment and perception. Reading required repeated effort. Conversations could confuse him. Planning, even minor, was often incomplete or abandoned. These challenges eroded confidence, creating moments of frustration and despair. The man who had once thrived on strategy and foresight now navigated life reactively rather than proactively. Capone's health challenges were compounded by aging. Fatigue, weakness, and the progression of syphilis left him increasingly dependent on caretakers. Daily routines were punctuated by periods of rest, medical attention, and observation. Physical frailty, combined with mental deterioration, created an existence defined by limitations rather than agency. Despite these constraints, Capone found some solace in reflection and memory. He recalled moments of triumph, of control, of influence. He remembered the streets of Chicago, the night's rhythm, the loyalty of his inner circle. These recollections provided a form of continuity, a connection to the identity that had been central to his life. Yet they were also bittersweet, highlighting the contrast between past power and present dependence. Capone's life in Florida illustrates the quiet consequences of a life once defined by extremes. Violence, excess, and notoriety had brought him fame, fortune, and fear, but they had also exacted a toll that became most apparent in later years. Freedom, when detached from agency and capacity, offered little comfort. The world outside had moved on, leaving the man who once commanded it isolated within his own limitations. As time passed, Capone's interactions with the outside world became increasingly rare. Visits dwindled, correspondence slowed, and news of Chicago's changing landscape reached him filtered and delayed. The city that had once been his domain continued without his presence. Operations, alliances, and rivalries persisted independently, underscoring the transience of power. Capone's existence in Florida was marked by quiet reflection, physical fragility, and cognitive decline. The man who had ruled through fear, strategy, and charisma now lived in a state defined by dependence, observation, and diminished capacity. The streets he had once dominated, the nights he had controlled, the empire he had commanded, all persisted without him, indifferent to his absence. In these final years, Capone's life was a study in contrasts. The legend remained powerful in the public imagination, while the man himself faced the slow erosion of body, mind, and influence. The nights he had once ruled were now populated by memory alone. And in the quiet, warm Florida afternoons, far from the chaos and power of Chicago, Al Capone confronted the profound reality that all empires, all legends, and all power are ultimately impermanent, leaving only the individual to reckon with time, health, and mortality. Al Capone's story, when viewed in its entirety, is not merely a tale of crime, power, and notoriety. It is a study of ambition, human complexity, and the impermanence of influence. From the crowded streets of Brooklyn to the neon-lit speakeasies of Chicago, from the heights of dominance to the isolating corridors of Alcatraz, his life charts a path that is as fascinating as it is cautionary. In reflecting on his journey, it becomes clear that Capone was more than a gangster, he was a man navigating extraordinary circumstances, whose choices, environment, and temperament combined to create a legend that has endured long after his death. Capone's rise began in the crowded tenements of Brooklyn, where opportunity and danger coexisted on every street corner. Early experiences shaped his understanding of the world, that power was earned, that respect could be commanded, and that survival often required moral flexibility. He absorbed lessons from family, neighbors, and gangs alike, developing instincts that would serve him in the violent, unpredictable environment of organized crime. Even as a young man, Capone demonstrated a combination of charisma, observation, and determination that marked him as exceptional. His intelligence was practical, honed by necessity rather than formal education. The streets were his classroom, and by the time he left for Chicago, he had internalized lessons about strategy, loyalty, and the dynamics of fear. Chicago, however, offered a scale of opportunity that Brooklyn never could. Under Johnny Torrio's mentorship, Capone learned how to transform street-level knowledge into organizational command. He observed, absorbed, and adapted. Torrio's philosophy, that violence was a tool, not a lifestyle, and that strategic patience often achieved more than brute force, reshaped Capone's approach to leadership. Through these years, Capone refined his ability to balance fear and respect, coercion and loyalty, visibility and discretion. Chicago's Prohibition era provided fertile ground for these skills. Demand for illegal alcohol created economic opportunities that required management, negotiation, and careful oversight. Capone's genius lay not merely in violence, but in his understanding of systems, how to structure operations, motivate personnel, and anticipate threats. The apex of Capone's power was both dazzling and perilous. He commanded vast networks of bootlegging, gambling, and other illicit enterprises, while simultaneously cultivating a public persona that softened his image. Philanthropy, public appearances, and careful media manipulation allowed him to present himself as a businessman and benefactor, masking the brutality that underpinned his empire. Yet this duality, charm and cruelty, generosity and terror, was both a strength and a vulnerability. The very visibility that reinforced his legend also drew scrutiny, ultimately contributing to his downfall. High-profile acts like the Valentine's Day Massacre consolidated power in the short term but intensified public outrage and federal determination to bring him to justice. Capone's eventual prosecution illustrates the remarkable adaptability of law enforcement in the face of organized crime. Unable to rely on traditional methods of witness testimony or local enforcement, federal authorities focused on a strategy that was both patient and precise: tax evasion. Numbers, documentation, and financial records became the instruments of accountability. The trial demonstrated that even a man whose influence had seemed untouchable could be held responsible when the mechanisms of the state were applied intelligently and methodically. Capone's conviction and subsequent imprisonment marked a turning point not only in his life but in the history of organized crime in America, signaling that no individual, regardless of power, was beyond the reach of law. Prison fundamentally transformed Capone. Alcatraz, designed to neutralize the influence of dangerous individuals, stripped him of autonomy and isolated him from the networks that had defined his existence. The structured routines, rigorous security, and social constraints forced Capone to confront a reality in which he could no longer control outcomes. These years revealed the fragility of power built on fear and notoriety. His physical health and cognitive abilities deteriorated due to untreated illness and the cumulative stress of incarceration, underscoring that even the most formidable human constructions, empires, networks, and reputations, are ultimately vulnerable to time and circumstance. Upon release, Capone's world had changed irreversibly. Florida offered warmth and relative quiet, but not restoration. The Chicago empire he had commanded continued without him, sustained by new leadership and shifting alliances. Freed from the constraints of law enforcement, he remained constrained by his own declining faculties. His public persona, once a potent tool of influence, had little utility in this new life. He existed largely in memory and reflection, navigating a world that no longer required his involvement, incapable of exerting the power that had once been his defining characteristic. The legacy of Al Capone is multifaceted. To some, he remains a figure of mythic criminality, a symbol of Prohibition-era excess and gangster glamour. To others, he is a cautionary tale, illustrating the dangers of unchecked ambition, moral compromise, and reliance on fear as a foundation for power. Yet a deeper examination reveals lessons beyond crime. Capone's life underscores the importance of adaptability, the limits of human control, and the inevitability of consequence. His rise and fall were not merely the product of chance or brutality, but of intelligence, opportunity, and the interplay between individual agency and systemic forces. In historical context, Capone also illuminates the broader social and political environment of his era. Prohibition created conditions that allowed criminal empires to flourish, revealing the unintended consequences of legislation disconnected from public behavior. Urban corruption, political complicity, and law enforcement limitations created gaps that figures like Capone exploited. Studying his life provides insight into the dynamics of power, social networks, and the interplay between legality and morality in an era defined by contradiction. Ultimately, Al Capone's story is a meditation on impermanence. Cities that he once controlled adapted in his absence. Allies and rivals alike moved on. Institutions he manipulated eventually corrected course. Even his own body and mind, once instruments of dominance, failed him over time. The myth persisted, larger than life, yet the man who inspired it faced decline, isolation, and mortality. His life is a reminder that influence, wealth, and fear are temporary forces, and that all human endeavors exist within the inexorable flow of time. Capone's narrative resonates beyond the specifics of organized crime. It invites reflection on leadership, legacy, and the human condition. The skills he mastered, observation, strategy, negotiation, and perception, are not inherently criminal, they are universally applicable.